All right, perfect. As people continue to enter, we'll be admitting them, but I'll go ahead and get us started. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome today to our final webinar of our initiative, the Transatlantic Webinar Series, Leading Through Crises. We're so happy to have you all join us. My name is Elena Schmidt, and I am a consultant at the German American Chamber of Commerce of the Midwest, which is headquartered here in Chicago. And for those of you who don't know us, together with our three sister chambers in New York, Atlanta, San Francisco, the American Chambers of Commerce are the official representative of German industry and trade in the US. And we are a part of a network of 140 German chambers abroad in 92 countries across the globe. As a part of this webinar series, each month we explored a different trade topic that was disrupted due to the pandemic. And the overall aim of the series was to find solutions to various challenges together. So today we will be discussing employment market disruption and the post-pandemic workforce, but we will conclude the initiative with a final hybrid event coming up in March, where we will release a special publication that summarizes the key insights and lessons learned over the past year from all of our webinars and workshops. And we'll also be inviting back past speakers to join us and share further insights. For those of you in the Chicago area, we would love to have you join us in person for a complimentary breakfast and networking before the event. But for those of you who are unable to make the trip, we would also love to have you there virtually. So my colleague will be sending, I believe in just a moment, a link to the events webpage in the chat if you would like to look at that and register. We'd love to see you there. Now moving on to today's event, we do have a few housekeeping rules. We ask that you do please mute yourself just to avoid any background noise for our presenters, but later on, we will encourage you to unmute yourself during the Q&A so that you can ask any questions. My colleague is also here for technical support. If you are experiencing any difficulties at all, please do use the chat function and message GACC Midwest, and we will do our best to support you. For those of you who are not as familiar with Zoom, in the top right-hand corner, you will see a view button, and you can change the view to either speaker view or gallery view. And gallery view will be great to see all the attendees during the panel discussion or the Q&A, and to hopefully bridge that virtual gap we may be feeling. But while the speakers are presenting, you can also do speaker view, which will highlight the main presentation. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat box and we'll be sure to address them in the Q&A, or as mentioned earlier, you can also unmute yourself and ask it yourself. And my colleague will also be dropping a link here as well to a folder that contains the agenda for today, along with the speaker presentations if you would like to look back at those. We have an exciting agenda ahead of us. We did have one speaker who was unable to make it today. However, we have 4 great subject matter experts here to share their insights. We have Kevin Depew, who is Deputy Chief Economist at RSM, and he will be giving sort of a macroeconomic perspective for the US workforce, followed by Werner Eichhorst, who is a coordinator of labor market and social policy in Europe at the Institute of Labor Economics. And he will be talking about the German macroeconomic perspective along with specific sector differences. Followed by Katharina Klump, who is partner at Bird & Bird, and she'll be giving more of the legal side and implications of working from home. And concluding this presentations will be Annalena Baumann, who is lead program manager of design careers at Airbnb, and she will be giving a presentation on her intercultural thought leadership in the field. And for the panel discussion, it will be moderated by my colleague, Justin Flexbot, who is senior manager here at GACC Midwest. So with that, we can start off the presentations and I will hand it over to Kevin. Kevin,
thanks very much. And should I share my screen? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, 1 second, let me just pull this up. I'm going to go through a couple of slides to talk about what the situation in the U.S. Labor market, which is a little bit different than what we're seeing in Europe, specifically Germany, where you have not seen wages recover quite to the level. And so let me just see if you can you see this okay?
Yes, we can, but you are not in presentation mode yet.
There we go. Does that show up okay?
We still see the where it has the next slide in the top right corner.
Okay, hold on.
It works for us, but.
Okay. Well, I apologize. I have multiple monitors. It's very challenging and
No worries.
to be able to get rid of the notes. So we'll just bear with me as we go through these slides. Hopefully they're clear enough, and I'll be able to talk through them in a manner that makes them reasonable. So the first thing that we want to talk about is the tightness of the U.S. labor market. And this is not just a post-pandemic phenomenon. It's not something that was created by the pandemic. You can see what we're looking at here is the number of job openings per unemployed worker. And so we're now at an extraordinarily high level. You have to go back to the late 90s in the United States to find a similar level of job openings per unemployed person. This didn't happen, again, because of the pandemic. Instead, what happened was the pandemic made the issues around labor supply in the U.S. much more apparent in a fashion that may have been unexpected by some people. Because that, if you look at the gray bars here, you can see the long duration of the recession around the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Which obviously reduced the number of jobs available per employee. And so over that long period of recovery from the Great Recession, which was marred by fairly sluggish growth for most of it, a fairly slow recovery for the labor market, it really didn't pick up until around 2015 in the US. But by the time we got to 2018, we had already reached really, I want to say, acute labor shortages in the US, largely driven by demographics, an aging population, and the reality that what saved the late 90s tight labor market in the US was the influx of all the millennials into the workforce. So you had the largest cohort other than the baby boomers in the US coming into the labor market pretty much all at the same time, reduced some of the tightness then. And so what has happened is that now we're 20 years past them entering the labor force. They're all in the labor force. There are no cohorts younger than them waiting to come in to relieve this acute shortage. At the same time, the US, beginning around 2016, was engaged in a policy level and policy-driven reduction in H-1B visas, effectively reducing some of the labor supply that could have helped alleviate the labor shortage in the US. Meanwhile, employers looked at it as, because of that slow growth period, they weren't really in a rush to bring in new employees because they just felt like, even though certain sectors were tight, they weren't seeing the labor supply issue that had been building for much of the past 10, 12 years. Well, that's where we are now. So when you look at that factor combined with the acceleration in the retirement of baby boomers as a result of the pandemic, and you can see that the percentage of retirees on a 12-month moving average in blue diverging from what would have been the 2008 through 2020 long-term trend in red, that 3.25 million excess retirements has further pressured the labor market and made it much more challenging for firms to bring in and even retain their existing talent. So again, if you look at Germany, you're not going to see these wage pressures yet. You're not going to see the employment quite back to pre-pandemic levels. But in the US, we've already shot above in terms of the employment cost index, wages and salaries in light green, and compensation in dark green there. So the way this manifests in one of my favorite data visualizations to illustrate what's happening is the difference between the job switcher, their premium that they get for switching jobs, versus job stayers. And that's what this chart tells the tale of. This is the Atlanta Fed's wage growth tracker. And there are three lines here. The top line there is your job switcher premium. So that's running at better than 5%. If you look at the middle line there, and among those three, that's the overall unweighted wage growth tracker. And then the bottom line there is your job stayer. So that divergence between job stayer and job switcher indicates that employees have reached a stage where they're increasingly taking employees from one another, and they're doing so by offering them wages or benefits in excess of what they could get at staying at their existing employer and just running through the typical wage increase cycles every year. Now, what you'll notice about this is these three lines tend to collapse during recession. So if you go back to 2008, 2009, they all merge together. And if you go back to the 2000s, you can see that period in the late 90s that I was talking about when the US had an extended period of a tight labor market. Well, now we have been seeing this divergence build since 2015 or so. Now the pandemic and the excess of baby boomer retirements, the loss of in particular those 25 to 54-year-old women in the US from the labor force have dramatically pressured and changed the balance of power between labor and capital in the US, which is something that's wholly unfamiliar for the past 20 years. That's why employers routinely are surprised by this, even though the demographics have been clear for a long time. The last chart I want to show is where the wage pressures are most acute in the economy. Now, you'll note that this is adjusted for inflation and seasonality. So that's why if you look at manufacturing, the real real hourly wages, because of the high rate of inflation that we have in the US, are actually running negative. And so that's, if you are in the manufacturing space and you're wondering why, well, look, I've increased hourly wages from 12 or 15 or whatever it is to 18, 21, 26. They're still not happy. Why are they not happy? Because in terms of real hourly wages, they're not seeing that benefit. Meanwhile, the other sectors of the economy that have seen wage pressures running above the rate of inflation, those are your trade, transportation, and utilities. Your non-farm private, the all category in red, and then in blue, that professional and business services. And then where you have the most acute wage pressures are obviously in leisure and hospitality, which are the most frontline facing of jobs, the ones most at risk for the pandemic, and the ones that have suffered the most from the loss of 25 to 54-year-old women in terms of labor force participation. So one note about this perfect storm that we're seeing in terms of the shift of power between labor and capital is that you have the acceleration of the baby boomers, in the context of low demographically driven labor supply in the US. You have that 25 to 54-year-old cohort of women who had, prior to the pandemic in the spring of 2020, had only then surpassed men 25 to 54-year-old in total in the workforce. So I can't overstate enough how demographically that is such a critical component of the workforce. Meanwhile, we have all of these issues, the work from home issues, the pandemic, the elder care, the child care, which disproportionately falls on those 25 to 54-year-old women, making it impossible, even if they want to go back into the workforce, to do so successfully. This entire perfect storm occurring at the same time, that we're having these debates about, well, are we going to be full-time? Are we going to be hybrid? Is there going to be more space for work from home? How is automation going to play into this? These are all the kinds of questions that I hope to hear from you and the other panelists today in terms of how do we address this issue. It's not going to go away. There's not going to be a magic ceremony that's held globally where people announce the end of the pandemic. It's going to fall away with a whisper, similar to what we saw in 1918-19, where we just learn to live with it and we make our way the best as we can. So a lot of challenges ahead, and look forward to having this discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin. That was a really great presentation. I know there was a lot of really good information in there. So like I mentioned, we have that shared folder in there with all of the presentations as well, if you guys want to take a look back at those graphs. I will hand over it now to Vanna Eichhorst if you would like to share your screen for your presentation. Perfect. We see your screen, yeah, but it is still not yet in presentation mode. So,
okay, that's like this. It should be better now. Is it fine now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me, and thanks for inviting me to this virtual presentation over there. I would like to maybe follow up on some of the observations that have already been made from a more European perspective. So, but what I would like to sort of employ is a very easy and straightforward typology of the different sort of segments in the labor market as they have evolved during the pandemic. And I distinguish between teleworkable and non-teleworkable work and between essential and non-essential work and that had, of course, quite diverse consequences for what we have seen in terms of business continuation or disruption over the last 2 years. There are a couple of, let's say, main occupational groups that I would like to discuss briefly with you. There are some that could move basically to work from home, especially those who deal with information, managerial and professional roles, and they are also in a situation that has been quite favorable to them over the last decades, including also non-automatable tasks that are quite prominent in this field. We have seen more instability during the pandemic with the other groups, so we do not exactly know for sure how they are going to fare after the pandemic, or maybe in a later stage of the pandemic, when not really knowing when the pandemic eventually ends and what that also means for long-term changes in consumer behavior and economic activity. I would also like to focus a bit more on the manufacturing sector, which is still very important in the German context, and maybe also in some other European countries, and the essential services that have seen a particularly stressful situation, I would say, over the last 2 years. So first, let's talk about remote work. Actually, at my institute, we have also done a couple of studies, more like a longitudinal study now on the prevalence of online work in Germany and what that also means for employers and for workers. We see huge differences within occupations, between occupations, but also between European countries. And this has something to do, of course, with the openness towards remote work that already existed before the crisis. This was quite diverse across firms, but also across work cultures that we could observe in Europe, but also within Germany. And when trying to summarize what we know about remote work by now, I think the consequences are somehow a bit ambiguous. I am not saying, well, this is sort of the silver bullet. It was somehow an inevitable step that was necessary to ensure business continuity where this was possible. It can also mean some type of cost saving on behalf of the employers when they downsize now office spaces and move to a more hybrid setting. But there is some price, I think, attached to that that becomes more obvious in some cases, sort of the disintegration of the firm and some loss of productivity broadly understood when it comes to sort of creative and unplanned interaction, which is becoming more and more difficult if you have a highly remote and dispersed workforce. For the workers, I think also the situation is somehow not so easy. During the lockdown of childcare facilities and schools, of course, this was even more severe, but the general ambiguity, I think, persists here. Sort of a mixture between easier reconciliation and autonomy on the one hand, but also exhaustion, isolation, and what we can also see, longer working hours, for example, not necessarily higher productivity. I think the evidence here is quite mixed. The return to the office will probably not take place like a return to the pre-pandemic normal. And this has then, I think, significant consequences for HR policies because they have to deal with a more complex and more fluid workforce and create sort of incentives and situations for purposeful interaction. In the European context, there is now some debate at both policy level, but also within firms and within collective bargaining about sort of approaching some regulation to the situation of remote work. here the basic question is, to what extent should there be hard rules, yeah, of being present or not being present, about being available and not being available. Most likely scenario is that we are going to have diverse settings, but not too strict or not too hard policies in most cases, but rather something like a negotiated type of flexibility. I also know that there is now a huge debate, both in the US, but also in some places in Europe, about if we're going to see a more spatially dispersed workforce in the medium and long run. I think the evidence here is not clear to what extent there is sort of an exodus from cities to rural areas, or even international virtual commuting, so to speak. So also this is something that we need to bear in mind. And of course, once this becomes more substantial, this has massive consequences for employment relationships. So let's move on to the medium segment. Specifically skilled workers, especially in the manufacturing segment. Here, I think there's a huge difference between, let's say, the North American experience and the European experience, because up to 50% of the workers were in job retention schemes in some European countries in the year 2020. It has gone down in 2021 and is somehow fading in 2022. But here again, there's an expectation of that job retention schemes can help stabilize work and sort of ensure a return to normal operating procedures in the later stage of the pandemic or after. This may not be true in all cases. And I think this, again, creates some sort of ambiguity and uncertainty with what is going to happen with the medium segment here, because while we see the pandemic evolving, we also see technological change and a competitive environment evolving. That means there will be some disruption also in this rather stable and I think globally speaking, extremely stable types of employment that we have observed in this medium segment. This is from one of our presentations that we had in 2020, the diverse picture regarding short-time work and changing in the unemployment rate. US, in a way, seen from a European perspective as an outlier with very low job retention activities, whereas the European countries try to stabilize as much of employment as possible. So this becomes increasingly demanding to stabilize and also to upgrade skills and work procedures in the medium segment, given the strong emphasis on employment stability and rather favorable working conditions. But this sector is also something that where collective bargaining and industrial relations are highly developed. So they have some capacities to manage change, even with limited, let's say, intervention by government. Yeah, so this is one of the strongholds of so-called social partnership. And we can see some adaptive behavior going on at the moment. We will see to what extent this is sufficient to cope with the challenges and demands put by changing world markets. So about the essential and the non-essential and non-time workable sectors, typically growth sectors, but they experienced a quite diverse fate during the pandemic. Some sectors saw an extra demand combined with emerging and aggravating labor shortages. Even now, I think this is also a topic for the year 2020, given that we see demand on the healthcare system, for example, on the elderly care system, also due to demographic change, not only due to the pandemic, while working conditions seem to create massive obstacles for longer tenure in that type of job. So this is creating additional problems, potentially also some disruptive forces that question established ways of organizing this type of services. We have also seen a massive disruption, of course, in those sectors that have not been classified as essential, where there was a massive disruption. And once the economy recovers and certain leisure activities are becoming possible again, there's now also some shortage because people left these sectors. I think the preceding presentation has already shown what that could mean. We can also identify similar tensions, maybe not as clear wage increases yet in the European context, but there is something going on, obviously, because it's cannot be taken for granted that these sectors attract labor force as they did in the past. So the Great Resignation in the US, but at least some tensions regarding labor shortages also in the low and the medium skilled segment in Europe, although we would not have expected that once we talk about digitalization and labor market polarization, that there would be severe labor shortages in that segment. So we can expect an intense debate about working conditions, not just pay, especially when it comes to care occupations, and new, let's say, demands on employers to make up their mind about sustainable and positive professional development perspective, also for those workers in the medium and maybe even essential occupations. I expect also that prices will increase for that type of services, meaning both public and private investment is needed to upgrade those sectors significantly. To last slide, just to summarize, I would say the pandemic has highlighted differences across segments in the labor market. It has made more long-standing issues regarding the world of work more obvious, especially the inequalities in the labor market. Maybe some of the dysfunctionalities of working routines have become more obvious, and of course also the consequences, the looming consequences of demographic change and technological progress, obviously. That means that working conditions and working routines are under extreme pressure in some cases, and that they need to adapt alongside skill profiles and more mobility-oriented public policies, in particular labor market policies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vanna. I know you have a lot of knowledge and information on this topic and could probably talk about this all day. So I'm excited to get to hear more from you during the panel discussion. For now, we will pass it over to Katharina Klump, and you can give us a little bit more about the legal aspects.
Yes, very happy to. So can you see my screen? I hope
yes,
that's
we can.
Okay, perfect. Well then, thanks very much. I think actually, Werner, you landed the base for what I'm going to talk about. So that's perfect, a perfect mixture. My name is Katharina. I'm an employment lawyer in Germany, and I want to share some of the experiences we made under the pandemic, and probably also to clarify that upfront in case you think what I say is kind of contradictory to Werner's speech to some extent. I work primarily with clients in the tech and comms sector, so certainly not manufacturing. So it's probably a slightly different view that I have or that I am going to share with you. Yeah, when the pandemic started in 2020, March, clients approached us basically with two questions. One was about short-time work, as Werner just said, and furlough in Germany, but also in all other European countries. And the other big topic was certainly, how can we have our employees to continue working when they are not allowed to leave their homes, so in lockdown periods. So the topic of mobile work is basically the main topic that I want to touch upon. And then just in consequences, you'll see, I'll also touch upon work from abroad, which just arises more and more, and we see it more and more that clients ask about that. And finally, some trends in employment in general. Let's start with mobile work. As I said, back in 2020 spring, clients asked all questions. What can we do? How can we ask employees to work from home? Can we actually ask employees to work from home, or what's the situation? Quite frankly, it's actually a sort of funny fact. German law does not provide for a definition of what mobile work, remote work, telework, whatever you call it, actually is. So it's a bit of a phenomenon. And it depends on what you agree with your employee, or what you as an employer agree with your employees on what you actually want them to do. And this is deciphered for the name then you probably choose for it. The general position, and this is in the middle, is the employer's right of instruction. This is basically the main concept of employment in Germany, is the fact that the employer determines how, where, and when employees perform their work. And on the other hand, the employer is also required to provide a place of work and all the equipment that is relevant. So Germany is a very, let's say, German employment law is very traditionally in a way. So the idea of work is actually very close to the idea of a work as a place to go. So many of the German employment laws are based on the idea that employees go to a certain place to perform their work. And then basically the pandemic proved that this is not necessarily true. Nevertheless, the main idea legally is actually that the employer provides such place of work. And therefore, the main challenge was, when the pandemic started, can an employer ask an employee to work from home? Certainly no, because it's the employer's obligation to provide a workplace. So on the other hand, this also means there is no general right for employees to request work from home. There is no statutory law that allows employees to decide that they actually want to work from home. And in this context, what does this mean practically? You need an agreement between employer and employee that decides how and where should the employee work. And frankly speaking, I think all players turned out to be very pragmatic in this regard. And that's what we heard from our clients, is that they all reached agreements, all employees, or where works councils are involved, works council found solutions how to arrange for work from home. I think the main reason in this regard is actually that most employees, they see it as an advantage when they are allowed to work from home. And therefore it was perceived as something positive, which is probably the main reason that everyone agreed to that. But our initial legal response was always, when clients asked that, can we simply ask them to work from home? Well, no, actually you can't. If it's not agreed in the contract, this is something that you cannot request from your employees to basically free up their kitchen table and provide for a private office. As I said, it turned out to work out okay in the beginning. This also found some, or created some, changes in German employment laws. As you see at the bottom, last year summer, we had a change in law in relation to works councils' co-determination rights. So this actually for the first time was then made clear: if employers allow employees to work remotely or to work mobile, then the works council has a say in it and has a co-determination right. However, again, it is not an enforceable right that employees or works council can request mobile work. It's still up to the employer to decide whether she wants to offer that or not. One reason in this regard is certainly that employers always, from a legal perspective, have an obligation to safeguard employees' health and safety. So this also means if employees are allowed to work from somewhere else, to a certain extent, this probably shifts this obligation to the employees, but certainly this is so important that this cannot fully be shifted to employees. So if you are in the situation to decide is this something you want to allow, yes or not, please take care that you have still obligation vis-a-vis your employees to protect their health and safety. As I said, from my point of view, most of our clients, they found solutions with their employees and works councils very, very quickly, how to implement mobile work. The funny consequence was then that actually back in September last year, the same clients approached us again, said, well, actually now we want them all to come back to the office. How can we do that? And the funny answer then is actually, well, actually it depends on what you have agreed to in the meantime. If you just granted them to work from home or mobile ongoingly without any caveat saying limited to the pandemic or up to a new decision or whatever, then yes, they are entitled now to work from home, whatever, in whichever form you practiced that in the past. And I mean, aside from the pure legal question, what can we do? It's also very clear employees enjoy this flexibility, and something that you have once been granted, it's very hard to give up again. So what we see now is that many companies already have or still are in the process to negotiate ongoing rules for mobile work. What we see a lot is like hybrid forms of either 2 days from the office, 3 days at home, or the other way around. And I think this then exactly leads to the next question. If employees realize that the workplace does not matter so much anymore, this leads to the question, well, actually, if it doesn't matter where I work, can I then also work from abroad? And this is something that happened quite often in the beginning of the lockdown phases. Flights were canceled so that employees just ended up to be stuck somewhere in the world, and then, of course, to work from there because practically they were not able to travel back home. I would say back then this was some of okay-ish, or at least I would say authorities would not have a too close look because it just happened and this was nothing that was intended. But I think the main takeaway you should have from this presentation today is that you should never allow your employees to work from home without prior agreement. Why is that? So I've listed just a few of the main topics from my point of view, but from an employment law perspective, the place of work is decisive for the applicable employment laws. So if an employee works abroad, he/she will automatically be subject to the laws of this country. Immigration is a huge topic. Typically, you will need a work permit to work in another country. If this is not secured, work is illegal, and this will have legal consequences not only for the employee, but also for the employer who allows work in this country. The whole aspect of social security is also linked to the place of work. If you allow employees to work from abroad, they might become subject to the foreign social security laws, or it may happen that the local social security and especially health insurance simply does not grant any more coverage. Same with, from a tax perspective, from the individual's perspective, income tax, the individual may become taxable abroad. The fact that someone works abroad can also lead from a corporate tax law perspective to the creation of a permanent establishment. And then more practical aspects, again, of course, as I said before, the employer has to secure health and safety, of course, the same also abroad, and data privacy is also a major topic. Therefore, it is possible, and there are solutions to most of these challenges, but please just don't do it because it sounds a nice idea to let your employees work abroad, but please take care you check in advance and have a proper agreement with the individual what actually is allowed or not allowed. I think most companies have come upon that and realized that in their standard mobile work agreements policies, they have a caveat saying, okay, mobile work only within, in my case, Germany or whatever country, original country that is the original place of work. However, what we see more and more is that companies really want to offer that as a benefit, because as I said earlier, if you are if you have been granted with some benefit, then it's really hard to give this up again. Employees see that practically it is possible to work from abroad. So many clients actually currently approach and says, we want to offer this as a benefit. We want to implement a policy, for example, allowing employees to work 30 days or 2 weeks per year from abroad. meaning if they are on holiday, they can extend the stay and add 2 weeks of work in wherever it is. So here in Europe, the place of, or the choice of country actually that we heard most about seemed to be Croatia. So many clients approached us that actually we have an employee and she would just love to work from Croatia for a while. That is certainly one of the trends that we see in employment law. And this also then leads to my last slide, general trends. So this flexibility, this is not only in relation to the place of work from my perspective, but also with regard to working time. We have many clients, and probably this is what Werner said earlier, it links back to the question of how to arrange for childcare during the pandemic. Many clients ask us, can we allow our employees simply to work whenever they want? Say we agree on 40 hours per week, and then they choose how to split that over the 7 days. The same with vacation. This is probably not in consequence of the pandemic, but just the general idea of granting employees more flexibility. Can we allow employees to choose the actual number of vacation days they think they need and grant them? More specific with public holidays. So I've heard that from several clients actually, that they had the idea to allow employees to choose themselves which public holidays they want to celebrate or not. So especially for religious holidays, saying you decide whether you celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever else and take these days off. From a German employment law perspective, this is unfortunately not as easy as it sounds, because we have very strict rules on working time regulations that regulate a maximum daily working time, break times between work days, prohibition of work on public holidays and Sundays. And of course, it is not in the employer's discretion to simply deviate from these rules. They are seen as protective to protect employees and to avoid this, let's say, freezing out between work and leisure time. So I think this is much more flexible in the US, but rather difficult here in Germany. And this leads then to my very last point, a trend, and probably this is up for the later discussion and links again back to what Kevin and Werner both said before. I would say there's a clear trend of an increase in benefits. It seems to me that employers take more care about their employees. Probably this is a consequence of the more virtual type of work that everyone is used to now, because there is a need for a closer connection, more need to retain employees. Yeah, I would be very happy to put that up for discussion for later on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Katarina. I know there was a lot of information in there that I think a lot of people in the audience found very helpful, and I'm sure people will have some follow-up questions for you. So please throw those in the chat if you do have any, and Justin will make sure to get to those in the panel discussion and Q&A. Which brings us to our last presentation before the panel discussion. Annalena, if you would like to take over.
Yes.
We see your slides, yes.
Perfect. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here. And it was just so interesting to listen to the other panelists, and especially Katarina, what you just shared brought up all my memories working back in Germany in HR, all that pain and regulations. So really interesting. Let me quickly explain you a little bit of my background, because my presentation will be a bit different to what you have heard so far. So I am originally from Germany, from Franconia, and have worked for 8 years or so for Siemens, big European company, as I always describe it to Americans like GE, but the European or German version of it. And 5 years ago already, I came over to the US. I'm based now out of New York City. In the last 5 years, I did not work for only one company as a German would do. I actually worked for Siemens here in the US. Then for 1 year, I founded a startup, an NGO. Then I worked for BMW, so German company, as you all are probably aware of, and was leading the learning and development department for the US market. And a little bit over a year, I made, how I would say in my own words, the bold step to finally work for a US company. So I'm working now for Airbnb and lead their learning and development for their design function. So I think if a German would look at my resume, the question would come up why I have changed jobs so often versus in the US. That's totally natural. And I'm bringing this up as well because with my presentation, I will share more my personal perspective, my personal views on trends. And also I try to bring in a little bit of both perspective from Germany and from the US, and maybe where are they the same or close to each other, and maybe where not. Okay. And also maybe to add on, I'm also close connected with the GACC, also the GACC in New York City, as I am an ambassador for the Young Professional Network, also now over 3.5 years. So time really flies. All right. So I just brought you actually 3 buzzwords, and I will speak through these 3 buzzwords. So the first trend I want to speak about is around flexibility. And I think we have heard this word in this presentation, or have it explained already in different forms, but also keeping in mind the Great Resignation, what's going on the labor market. In my opinion, really, flexibility what sets you apart as an employer to really be attractive for employees going forward. And in the US, I would say next to compensation and benefit, flexibility will be really the most important factor while thinking about recruiting and retaining talent. And here it already starts with the comparison Germany versus the US. I think what we have to keep in mind when we speak about the US is that the country is way bigger than Germany is, and we have also different states, so similar as the different Bundesländer in Germany. So maybe challenges you have working in different countries in Europe, you already have this as a company because you need to have some legal, and I'm sure, Katharina, you know that better than I do, but you need some legal entities in the States, or at least need to be registered as a company there. So I'm bringing this up because it all sounds so nice in theory, but yes, there are really some roadblocks for companies to offer all that flexibility if you actually want to offer this. And it also depends, obviously, also, as we heard earlier, if it's even possible from the nature of work to offer this flexibility, because there might be some jobs like in the service production industry where you have to be present, and where it's not about choosing when you want to come in, because basically you have your job because otherwise the belt may be stopped because you are not there, which probably should not be the case. I also, a month ago or so, I read a recent HBR article who was actually criticizing the word flexibility. And obviously, I was really curious to read that thought, because for me, I was always going out the last couple of months and talking about flexibility. And for me, this was a really aha moment while I read through this article, because obviously flexibility is defined from everybody defines it differently. And also it might be different from in what country you live. So especially if I speak with my German friends and talk about flexibility, they tell me that they have flexible working conditions because they can work from home 2 days a week on Tuesday and Thursday. But for me, now living in the US, that's not flexibility. That is basically my employer describes me when and where I have to work. So I think this is also keep in mind when you talk about flexibility. So what I actually mean more by it, more from an American mindset, is really the freedom of work. I think this term maybe even catches us better than flexibility. Because it's really meant that you basically can decide when and where you want to work. So for instance, taking me as an example, I currently really have totally flexibility from where I want to work, in terms of I may have to give my employer 2 weeks heads up that I may want to work from Europe, though they can clarify all that legal and tax obligations and where they actually pay my salary from. But also I can decide if I go to the office like 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, up to 5 days a week. So it's really up to me. And this is also, just sharing personally, a big motivational factor, having that freedom of work. And I'm bringing this up. This is my personal perspective. There are other circumstances, other people, other preferences. So I think from an employer perspective, while now setting up all these new fancy regulations, how and where your employees are supposed to work, I think the most important thing, what you need to do, is to listen actually to your employees and try to understand what they actually want. And that can be different for every single person. That does not mean you need to find a regulation or HR policy that is true for everyone 100%, because we are still like an employer here. But you want to make sure that you hear them, and if you can find a common balance, as we heard earlier, child obligation, there might be other circumstances. There might be actually that I really can't working from home because I may have, I don't feel like I don't want to be alone. I think we always talk about families and kids and being overwhelmed in terms of, because there's so many going on. But I think, especially thinking about New York City or also San Francisco, so the biggest cities, there are also a lot of singles. So they actually may want to go to the office to have some social interactions. So with that, I'm really saying, keep in mind what maybe your employer wants and just ask them, because they will tell you. And also, I actually brought a quote, or I would like to quote my CEO from Airbnb, because he recently in an interview was asked basically the same question around flexibility and who will actually dictate where employees will work. And he actually said, well, I don't think CEOs are going to dictate how people work in the future. I think employees will. Because if a CEO says you have to go back to the office, they're going to have a choice. Do I want all the talent pool or just the people willing to come into my office? So I think this is a very interesting thought, that going forward, the employees will get more power because they got to choose from maybe also for what company they will work. And with this thought, one last comment going back also to Germany, is this may sound very revolution or very rebellious to maybe some German styling in here today. And also I think we need to keep in mind that in Germany, we have a very strong Mittelstand, as we say, so very big, small, medium-sized companies. And they are often family owned, and meaning there are tradition in these companies. There might be some mindsets that people only work if they are physically present. So these are just some thoughts, and I think you can have the best HR policy in place, but if your company culture and mindset doesn't allow for it, it's basically set up for failure. So with that, I'm saying maybe having the total freedom of work might be not work for every Mittelstand company in Germany, because it's just not a match with their culture. But I think being open and really try listening to your employees is the right way to go. And I feel more like pledging here. So this is really more my personal thoughts. So obviously you can take it or leave it. So the second trend I'm seeing is around belonging. And so we already heard today, there might be now different working models like remote, like hybrid, maybe some have to go 5 days a week into the office. But I think despite of what working model you decide, there will be always this human need for belonging. And in my opinion, companies need to consciously design for belonging in the employee experience, also to retain talent. So this is really also so important. I was thinking about that one graph we saw earlier, speaking about tenure within a company. So in the US, obviously, there's way more fluctuation on the labor market than it is in Europe or Germany. So this can be also one differentiating factor in order to retain your talent. And to make this a little bit more tangible, because belonging is, again, a buzzword. What could this mean? And this is really different from every company. Again, it's really important that it fits to your culture. Otherwise, it can even have the other effect that it's not working and people are leaving because you're not walking the talk. So if you decide more going for remote work, it could be really that you plan for conscious interactions. And these doesn't need to be fancy things. Like it could be just that you have an employee event together where you have some fun. Because normally with all the Zoom calls, we are so focused on the work, and how we say these water cooler moments, which I'm sure you all heard about, are kind of missing. So therefore we have to consciously make space for these moments to happen, because they will not happen on a natural base anymore. And also, I'm sure by now you all have heard about employee resource groups. So maybe more if you think about diversity and inclusion, but give employee the opportunities so that they can create and be active in a field besides their job description, because that can really connect them and create a feeling of belonging. And I think for the office, we all know for years this example with Google, what experience they design at work. And I think this will also for the hybrid world, a trend that if you go to work, it needs to be an experience. Like you really want to go because it's so cool. Be it that you meet with your colleagues on Monday for this breakfast and the CEO share out around strategy, or be it that on Friday we have a passion share out and everybody can share their passions and we hear from a different colleague every week. So things which really make you excited, which maybe not like one meeting after the other, because then where's the benefit of going into the office? And so this is my few thoughts on belonging. And last but not least, just some thoughts around purpose. And this word is also nothing new because it has been on the E-team agenda for quite a while, especially if we're talking about vision and strategy, like the why always came up the recent years. So that's nothing new. I think what is new is that really employees over the pandemic reflected on the why and the purpose. And why do I work for this company? Because maybe there was less going on in their lives, or even more, so they were really focused on their work, or they had to make space for it. So I think what's really new nowadays, if we talk about purpose, is that we need to bring it from that organization level to the individual level to make really sure what I'm preaching as a company reaches the employees, but that might be even the wrong mindset, because you should actually, in my opinion, include the employees in the purpose discussion, because they really need to make it their own in order that they are engaged, that they are loyal, and that they see it makes sense for them to stay with you as a company. So it's really about creating some maybe employee groups. Again, it might be around culture where really people can be very active. I did this, for instance, at BMW here in the US. I created a culture ERG, which was new because ERGs were often before that more related to diversity and inclusion. So, and people really like signed up and wanted to lead projects. And with that, they were really like felt that fire again, which I think a lot of us have naturally lost over the pandemic. So it's really important to bring that passion also back to work. All right, so these are my 3 thoughts around what can also really set you apart from other companies, and also what may help you in order to retain and also recruit the best talent which is out there.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Anna-Lena. I really enjoyed your perspective and all those buzzwords. That was great. And I think we are actually right on time for the panel discussion. So Justin, I'll let you take it over from here.
Excellent. Well, first of all, thanks everyone for joining. Also from my side, I've been here all along, but silent up until this point, just listening to all the fascinating comments from our diverse panel of speakers. My role at the Chamber is actually first and foremost in recruiting, both for us internally as well as for our client companies in German American business. So these sorts of topics are things that I've been following closely, of course, touching on my day-to-day work. And I'm very excited to have an open and interactive discussion with our 4 panelists here today. At the conclusion of the panel discussion, of course, we will also open it up for the audience. So if you have questions that have already come to mind, it would be helpful if you'd get those into the chat sooner rather than later so I can start, organizing my thoughts and getting ready for that component of the event today as well. But yeah, I'd like to start off by continuing. I know that all 4 of our speakers touched on it, but work from home. It's not just a pandemic thing. It's not going to go away. I think in both countries, in some way, shape, or form, work from home is here to stay. And it's touching on probably the business of every company that's in attendance today. So at the risk of beating a dead horse, as we say, I would also like to spend a considerable amount of time talking about different subtopics within this broader topic. So the first one is really related to that kind of trust versus control that I believe, Werner, you had mentioned in one of your slides. Looking at some studies, they've pretty much shown that productivity has actually not gone down. And in certain cases, people are actually more productive working from home. They're not spending an hour commuting each direction. Maybe don't find, maybe the water cooler talk is distracting to them. I don't know, but that certainly doesn't mean that every employee can be equally as productive as their colleagues. So what advice would our panelists have for employers on the call today or on the webinar in terms of finding that right balance between trust and control, also keeping in mind, of course, from a policy perspective, HR policy perspective, you have to treat all employees equally. You can't say, well, employee A I trust, so we're just going to let them do their thing, but B, we need to put in these extra rules. So just open question for any of our panelists if you'd like to chime in with that.
I mean, probably I can start. So again, it's just my perspective for what I hear from clients, and actually the number of clients who have issues with the lack of trust is quite low. Frankly speaking, I don't had any case where, I mean, probably there have been some cases, but rather minor ones, where employers had concerns that employees do not work. But looking back at the last 18 months, I think actually this has not been such a big deal. And I'm quite surprised by saying so, if I'm honest.
Well, that's a positive insight. So maybe I'm making a challenge where there isn't one. Werner, please.
Well, maybe I can also add to this. Of course, there have also been some news reports on, let's say, innovative digital technology to supervise and control and even bureaucratize remote work, I think. But yeah, I think this is not the dominant trend. And I'm reassured to hear that this is not so relevant also from a legal perspective. So what I think, and I think, Katharina, you mentioned that somehow implicitly, is that the transition to this more flexible in mobile work, it also worked in Germany, but it worked because we somehow allowed ours to neglect a lot of rules and routines and to violate maybe some standards that we are used to. Actually, when looking into, especially for knowledge workers, I think one of the most violated pieces of legislation that is around is a Working Time Act. Yeah, so this is basically not observed. It is neglected. It is violated regularly, and then maybe this is part of an explanation why we can work so flexibly in the German context only. That also means, I think, that there's trust that makes sense. Allowing people to also to decide when to take a break, for example, yeah. But what we can also see is that sometimes under the flexible and the remote work environment, it takes a bit longer, yeah, to finish work. Yeah, so that means maybe the hourly productivity is somehow an issue. People finish their job. It's sort of result-based, but it may take longer, yeah, and it may be stressful because work extends more into the evening or into the weekend, because maybe during the day you have done something else. So that could be one of the ambiguities that we can observe. People will work around that, and what I think is also true that individual let's say psychological dispositions make a huge difference. Yeah, to what extent can people organize themselves, create sort of a time frame and sort of a locational frame to work productively as if they were somehow in a professional environment. Yeah, I think this is something some people learn quite easily to do that. Others, I think, are still struggling more. But control, I think, would not help that much here. Rather, maybe some coaching or some advice may be given.
Understood. Yes. Annalena, please.
No, it's just about to say I totally agree. I actually don't like that word control at all, because that already speaks so much about distrust to me. And also to make it a little bit more tangible, a friend of mine actually works for a European company here in the US. And when the pandemic started, they were very well aware of, as employees, that the employer was tracking the active time. So meaning if your mouse gets moved and you are green, or if you're orange, when it switches over, if you don't move it for 5 minutes. Because they had working times from 9 to, I think, 5:30 and 30 minutes break, and they were supposed to be there on time and move their mouses. So basically, this is what ended up happening, like dialing in on time to move the mouse. And of course, at 5:30, you're so demotivated, you dial off because it's 5:30. So you don't need to move the mouse again. So I think that for me is such a good example of maybe having intention that your employee should work, but it may create the different outcome. And I'm there more for pledging trust. Obviously, there might be always the one who sticks out, who may be better, you should have not trusted, but I think also you will find out rather quickly who that person is if there's no work outcome, basically. And also, we had this also back in the days. We had in Germany, we say the Frühstücksmanager, though the newspaper manager, basically those who went into the office and were reading newspaper half the days. And it was kind of just accepted because they had a certain tenure with the company. So I think we also need to keep that in mind, that there is no 100%, and that I would rather vouch for trust versus control.
Understood, yeah. And without naming names, of course, here in the US, there was in the news a company that was using the supervisory technology, which led to a massive layoff and pretty negative PR. So that's maybe something to consider as well for your organization. So moving, go ahead, Kevin, please.
One thing to follow up on that is I think it's important in the US especially to recognize that the control works both ways now. That we're accustomed because employers have had free reign for most of the past 20 years in choosing what activities they want to consider work and what activities they want to consider, okay, that's your free time. Now, the perception among employees is that, well, I'm effectively living at work, not working from home. And in doing so, I'm providing my own broadband, I'm providing my own electricity, I'm providing all these own services and additions, paper access to printer, all these types of technologies that now it's all my responsibility. I don't have an IT department at home. And so there is an increasing risk that the more employers try to step in, as exactly in your example, Justin, the more likely it is that employees are going to start to push back very severely against this.
Excellent. Great. So a kind of a follow-up question that's somewhat related is just in terms of, day-to-day management and communication between, department heads and then their direct subordinates, not maybe talking at the CEO level. But of course, if you're at different places and you can't just pop your head into their office and ask a question, how much is too much? What recommendations would you have for, just proper communication between managers and employees, and also, frankly, oversight of work quality on a day-to-day basis? Maybe not are they working, but even everything related to maybe feedback. Sometimes it's harder to provide criticisms in a virtual form than it would be in person. So any advice for those managers out there in terms of how to best communicate and control the work of their employees on a day-to-day basis?
I can go first if that's fine. We had the word control again. Just kidding.
You're right. Oops.
No, just kidding. So I think there's no right one answer. I think what I would recommend actually to talk about it, like to talk and make it a topic. How do you actually want to communicate, and what channels do you prefer to communicate? Because there might be a new hire that started remotely, that like I did over a year ago, which might be struggling in the beginning because there is no natural interaction points. So I was glad that my buddy actually checked in with me on a regular basis because I had a go-to person, versus maybe after a year, my foot will feel a little bit more of a controlling style. So I think it's therefore important to really talk about it, set expectations. And also when I was mentioning the communication channels, like for me, it was also a big difference coming from BMW, working from Airbnb. I may get one email a day. Otherwise we do Slack. And then on top of that, then my manager texted me, and then I got on top of that a voice message. And I was like, okay, why can't we just do emails here? So I just want to, and I'm bringing up this example because it's again a topic also of work culture in the industry and preferred ways of communication. And it's just important that you are clear what channels you use for what circumstances and why.
Excellent. Another thing that would be of interest to me is, I believe, Werner, you had spoken, I think you called them teleworkable, or people whose job functions allow them to work from home, and those who don't. Obviously here, manufacturing, if you're working on the shop floor, running the machines, you need to be in person. If you're on the sales and marketing or accounting team, maybe you don't. If we accept that this ability to work from home is generally considered positive and maybe even a benefit of employment, what should employers do to maybe compensate in some other way those employees who don't have this ability to work from home? I might not have phrased that question the best way, but hopefully you get what I'm getting at, so that there's maybe not any sort of, anger might be too strong of a word, but seeing some of your colleagues with this new benefit, this new ability that you don't have. Have you seen that in either in the US or in Germany, that employers are trying to find some other way to otherwise compensate these people who can't telecommute?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. Actually, it has been around, let's say, below the surface in Germany in 2020. Yeah, I did some interviews also with newspaper journalists, but it actually is, to the extent that I know and I have tracked the developments, it has not really materialized. And maybe one of the reasons is that being able to work from home is maybe not just a privilege, it can also be a burden, yeah. So that the question is, to what extent do these people need to be compensated? You also encounter sort of a blurring of the boundaries. You have the issue of working time, maybe enlargement to some extent, and you have some private costs involved, like office equipment that you would need, telecommunication, electricity, heating, and so forth. So there, you may even ask those people who can still go to work and work there and leave the work behind in the evening, like Katharina has said, they are the best protected, I think. And in a way, this is still somehow the normality. And in a way, it's cheaper because you, of course, all the infrastructure is being provided over there. So I'm not sure to what extent this really needs sort of a fairness debate here.
Kevin, do you see things maybe differently here in the US market?
I don't know that I do yet, but I do sense that as things have dragged on and we've been in this essentially forced work from home environment, that there are some rumblings of the perspective shift that we've talked about. So I would say it's early stages. I don't have definitive evidence of that, but it's certainly something to watch out for.
Werner, please.
Maybe one thing that we could add, this is interesting, that there has been some response in the tax system actually, because now there's sort of a flat rate tax discount in Germany that is available for, I think, 120 days times €5 per day for those people who work at home. Yeah, because in a way they lose the tax advantage of the commuting allowance. Yeah, you see. So this is sort of an exchange. You cannot deduct your driving distance anymore if you work at home, and you encounter additional expenses, as I said, regarding heating and electricity. So there's some sort of a publicly administered compensation going on here.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
Sorry, can I add one aspect?
Please
so
do.
I know that, for example, in retail, companies have such internal policies that, for example, request employees in administration to work, let's say, a little less flexible than they could in order not to have such a huge discrepancy to those working actually in the stores. So, for example, that it's not that easy to have to take bridge days off, because if the shops are open, people on the floor have to work, and therefore admin functions should work as well. So this is probably a tendency in this regard, but then I don't know if this is just one example or a general trend or view. But I think actually I think it is very likely that companies take that into account, because I would still say that most employees, even though financially it is not necessarily a benefit, see it or perceive it as a benefit if they are allowed to choose where they work, and then compared to those functions who can't.
Right. Werner, please.
Maybe one more thing that is a bit more speculative. So I think maybe it's too easy to distinguish between jobs that are fully teleworkable and jobs that are fully non-teleworkable. Employers and workers can also try to maybe isolate the teleworkable parts of those who are predominantly not able to telecommute, so that at least some additional options for flexible location can emerge. So I could imagine that also using digital technology, this can even be the case for some people working in a manufacturing environment, for example, to the extent that they sort of supervise some machinery. So they do not have necessarily to be present there.
Okay, excellent. Great, so moving on, another thing, of course, that's very interesting, and I think, Anna-Lena, you referred to this as freedom of work, is, working from home doesn't necessarily mean you have to be at home. I right now actually am in my parents' house in St. Louis. My company is in Chicago and I live in Denver. few years ago, this wouldn't have been possible, and it's great. But I haven't left the country, so we don't at this point in time, and I'm just here a few days, not creating any tax issues. But there are issues. I know, for instance, my working full-time in Denver, that's an extra administrative burden for our HR department. So, it's nice to have that flexibility, and I appreciate that my employer has allowed me to do that. It might not work for every company, but from a recruiter's perspective, it's a great thing for talent acquisition to be able to offer this sort of flexibility. So first of all, maybe Kevin, for you, Katarina had kind of talked about at the EU level, maybe Germans wanting to work from Croatia. What advice would you have for those American companies on the line that have employees maybe located in one state where their operation is in another? Are there best practices maybe to consider in terms of balancing this, talent acquisition and attraction aspect, and of course, as I said, extra administrative burden that this places on the HR department?
Well, it does. Some of those excess burdens are simplified with some consulting off-the-shelf software at this point. So that's a little bit easier to get past. But what I do see is that if you are actively recruiting for talent and you are not explicit in the description that it is remote work, or that it's a job that you're available to work anywhere, then people are going to go right past that. We have seen that internally in our firm and had to change the way we were actively recruiting for employees because of that. And so that is certainly going to continue. And it's first and foremost front of mind for employees as they're looking to transition to either a new role or even to a new company, that you have to be able to be explicit about that if you're going to get them, or they're not even going to look at the job description.
Understood. Do any of you panelists see maybe some long-term changes in the legal environment, Katarina, maybe to formalize or change some of the laws to make it easier, maybe if not internationally, at least within the EU, for a German to work from Spain, or potentially a German company to hire a Dutch worker who doesn't want to relocate? Are we seeing trends either at the EU level or at the German federal level to kind of maybe address this from the legal perspective?
Mm. Actually, I'm not aware that there's anything planned. Werner, if you please chime in, but generally I see that there's a need for that. And I think in Asia, for example, they offer the ability to have a sort of work permit in one country if you work abroad. I don't know how it works exactly. I just learned that from my colleagues that actually they have such rules, and therefore I would just assume that this will likely also, or that there's a good chance that this might also change here in Europe, especially within the EU.
I would like to bring in a different perspective, not on employment law, because that's definitely not my expertise. But I think if we think about this flexibility, and I think it's seen as a burden of HR, obviously it's a lot of work for HR, for legal departments. I think currently, if we talk about this, we focus a lot on the challenge part. But I would like to shift that mindset and say, wow, how cool this is as an employer to have such a big potential talent pool. Like before, maybe I was local in San Francisco and all the talent needed to be there physically or had to move. So I had to also pay relocation costs. But now I could hire somebody from Texas or maybe even from another time zone if my working environment and the conditions allow it. So how cool is that? Like I have so many more opportunities, especially speaking about some labor shortages on the labor market. So that's from the employer perspective, but also from the employee perspective. Taking myself again as an example, my company is based out of San Francisco. I would not work for that company if they would have not allowed me to stay in New York, because I don't want to move during a pandemic and I know nobody in San Francisco. So giving that flexibility just opens up different opportunities for employers and employees. Of course, we need to make sure like all the paperwork, HR, legal things are taken care of, because you don't want to risk that, obviously. But I think there's a big positive aspect to it as well.
So assuming that companies are at least maybe some of the larger organizations and those maybe that are a little bit more tech focused are having this kind of disparate workforce. They're attracting the best talent from wherever they are. But that brings up the issue then, and I think it was Facebook where they basically were adjusting the salaries per local cost of living. You mentioned San Francisco. I think everyone, even the Germans on the line, know that's a very expensive place to live. Well, maybe I want to move to Des Moines, Iowa, where I grew up. Just as an example, which has a lot lower cost of living, and I'm doing the same job as my colleague who is located in San Francisco. I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer, but from your gut instinct, from the employer perspective or the employee perspective, what would you recommend to companies in terms of their policies for remuneration with this kind of geographically dispersed workforce? Anyone, please. You don't have to raise your hand. Just we're small enough group. Just chime in.
But again, I just want to point out this is really my personal perspective, and I think every company has to find their own way of doing things. If I would own a company and would need to set up new guidelines, how I would structure it, basically, I would divide the employees in 3 different pots, if you want to say so. One is these employees, by the nature of work, have to come in, so need to be in an office. Or these employees in maybe San Francisco. Then there is a second pot. These employees maybe need to go in twice a week and therefore need to live 50 miles away from an office of my company in the US, but they can choose at what office this might be. And the third one might be the complete remote, because I don't care, maybe because they are back-end engineers, and I don't care if they are in Texas or in another state in the US. And based on that, I would make my decision what salary band they are having. And basically, obviously, those who have to live and come in San Francisco would have a higher salary, whereas those who can work from everywhere they want to. And if they decide to still live in San Francisco, basically it's their choice. So this is an easy thing to do if you start up with a new company, right? But if you have employees living already in San Francisco, having that amazing salary for years, and then you tell, like, now I will cut your salary down 50%, they will be not in favor and will probably leave. So I think this is then the bigger challenge, how you do that transition, and it may be not something will happen from a day to the others, and there needs to be some adjustments happening. But I would see that this is the way to go, because then I could also hire that remote employee from India, for instance. So it does not even need to be in the US.
Yeah, I would just add that prior to the pandemic, this idea of agglomeration, which was particularly popular in tech, because you had those high density cities, the super tech cities, so San Jose, San Francisco, Austin, even places like Madison, Wisconsin, which was heavy on educational and medical technologies, of the Southeast Research Triangle, all of these super cities that were viewed as being, I guess, ultra competitive with one another, but leaving the other areas that were near them. So even if you travel 45 miles outside or 45 minutes outside of any of these major super city hubs, you would see the economy fall off. You would see the density start to disperse. And so those were all perceived as negatives. And so you had this increasing concentration, which not only drove up compensation costs in those cities, but costs of living as well. So it's no accident from an economic standpoint that when you have that companies taking advantage of agglomeration, it raises the cost of living for everybody. And you start to see a draining of everybody except those high-tech workers who are highly compensated. So this is ripe for rethinking, because just because that was our attitude prior to the pandemic, it's not yet clear that that is really a useful way of operating as a business. You not only had the negatives of that for the remainder of the community that may not be employed there in terms of cost of living increases and those types of things, but you also had a lack of diversity, which is critical to having a successful business. And that's one of the things I fear was getting lost as we entered 2018, 2019. So it will be interesting to see how companies adapt to this. It is going to be, I loved Annalena's suggestions for how to deal with this. But this is a longer term structural issue in not only the US, but in global economies. And how do we deal with the over concentration of employment and technology and compensation in major urban areas, usually at the expense of the other less populated rural areas outside of the cities.
Excellent point. Anything else from our other speakers to add to this topic? Okay. Please, Werner.
Maybe just a short note. Of course, the flexibility of wages tends to be smaller in the German context, yeah, because we typically have some collective agreements. They would make it very difficult to downgrade. Of course, there are extra payments, and in the private sector there is some flexibility, but it's more limited. And it's definitely not something that is acting or reacting so quickly as it is obviously the case in some places in the US.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I see so many coming in from the chat. Maybe I'll just cut short my prepared questions and make sure we get to those from the audience so that we have a chance to address everything that they'd like to hear from you. But sticking kind of on this compensation topic and not related necessarily to work from home, but just to the tight labor markets in both countries. Obviously, we're seeing wages going up, but I'm not too sure what the status is in Germany. But of course, here inflation is also rising. Kevin, as you said, even in manufacturing, real wages are actually declining, if I read your graph properly. So beyond, offering a couple more dollars an hour, what else can employers do to really attract this talent? For instance, even in hospitality, that was a striking figure to see how much that's going up. I know every restaurant in my neighborhood has a hiring sign on the door. Some of them aren't even open every day because they just don't have enough employees. How do you get these employees back in all industries, but specifically those that really are facing these recruiting and retention struggles? What would you recommend, either tangible benefits, or maybe Annalena will talk more about cultural things that companies can do to make them attractive for employees?
Maybe also, I think it's important to keep in mind what country we are in, actually, because I think, and for me, this was super interesting when I moved to the US, because as a German worker, for me, obviously, salary, right? Then PTO days, because by law, you have 20 or 24 in Germany, depending if you work 5 or 6 days a week. And maybe some companies offer like 30 days, so which is nice, but also holidays are basically prescribed by law. And when I started off working here in the US, you ask different questions. You ask for benefits, but not in terms of benefits of a fruit basket or having like a hairdresser on site. You ask for health insurance, you ask for 401k. Because for me, this was such a big eye-opener, because you don't have this like by nature. So it's super important for you as a company to offer this, because this will really set you apart, which is definitely more, or in my personal experience, if I talk with Americans, more important than PTO days. They are fine having 5 to 10 PTO days if they can make a good salary and can afford the college for their kids. It's a different mindset. I think this is important to keep in mind if we talk about benefits, and assuming that these benefits are taken care of, and we're talking more about the soft, engaging, cultural, as you said, benefits. I think then there are different options. And I can give now some example, but I think, again, it's important that it fits to your culture. For instance, I had just 3 days ago a chat with a friend of mine back in Germany, and we were talking about benefits, and I said to her, I know that Google actually offers legal support and for adopting a child, or also for a woman freezing their eggs. Like, this is unbelievable in Germany, also due to ethical standpoints and so on. But I think the point I want to make with that is that you need to know your target group as an employer. and try to understand what is actually a benefit for them. Because if I would offer a benefit that is not beneficial, it will not change something. So make sure you ask your employees and keep in mind your target group while defining maybe new benefits.
I would just add that there's, in the US, there is, and Annalena did a great job of outlining some of the cultural differences in the US versus Germany and Europe. But this idea of dependent attachment on the employee-employer relationship is something that has been tremendously popular for a long time. It's the status quo in the US versus mutual attachment, and something that would be mutual attachment. So healthcare, for example, might be a dependent attachment. My healthcare costs, if I leave to go to another employer, may go up, and it may go up to an extent that I wouldn't even view the salary adjustment as being appropriate. But a mutual attachment would be something like education. So because we are still in the mindset of an industrialization workforce and education in the US and most advanced economies, we've forgotten that once you get married and leave secondary school and have an employment, that you don't need to educate yourself anymore, you're done. And so you know everything. And so I think one of the ways to create that mutual attachment is for employers to be much more serious and dedicated in education for the long term. So not education toward a specific employer desired goal, but education for an employee to fill some of those buzzwords that Annalena showed earlier. So the idea to be able to have that mutual attachment, because I know my employer cares about my educational advancement, not just preparing for the next job at this firm, but for me to have a sense of purpose around employment. That's something that we've not yet done. And it's a shame because we've moved away from the industrialized economy, the so-called old economy, 25 years ago. So here we are 25 years into the new economy, seeing some of the benefits of what we were promised in the late 90s start to materialize. And we're still operating as if we need a 9-to-5 US workforce that is assembly line based, where you show up on time, don't make trouble, and you get compensated fairly for it. Hopefully, that's not sustainable. That's no longer what we're going to be living with. And if employers do not recognize that and do not create that mutual attachment, they're going to be perpetually finding themselves in high turnover situation where employees leave to go to areas that do cater to that desire for that mutual attachment.
Excellent comments, everyone. So scrolling here through the chat and some of the questions that have come in, and of course, if you're in the audience and still haven't put it in, please do. We're looking at the time, got about 15-20 minutes left here. Specific question for you, Katarina. What legal issues might a German firm face by using the Estonian E-Residency program to employ workers from anywhere in the world? And more widely, do others have thoughts on the future of these kinds of E-Residency program? So that is kind of touching on a question that I had asked earlier in the panel, but of course, Estonia is leading, I guess, internationally in this sort of cross-jurisdictional talent field. So how does that work with the Germans?
So first of all, I must confess, if there's someone who can explain exactly what the Estonian E-Residency regulation is, I think that might be very helpful.
Well, Thomas Leek, are you here? He asked the question. Maybe he can provide some background. If so, please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm in a coffee shop though, so I've been muted. Didn't want to. Well, I'm working from the coffee shop. Here we are. Yeah, the Estonian E-Residency program, as far as I know, is relatively new. And the issue came up because I was talking actually to a software developer about coming on board, but he was not in a place where we were. So I thought we have this E-Residency program through Estonia where you can get some sort of legal recognition for your right to work in Estonia. We have a presence in Estonia, so we can work with that, but it's EU, so maybe that's okay as well. As it turned out, this worker did not want to use it because he didn't want to have to pay taxes. The whole thing was some sort of tax avoidance scheme, but but yes, with Estonia, as far as I know, and I think it's relatively new, you can get the right to work in Estonia if you're not in, even if you're in, I don't know, Kazakhstan or or maybe India, I don't know. And then a European company can set up a legal entity in Estonia and employ you from, via Estonia. That's my understanding of it.
Okay, probably let me try to comment on that. So I actually did some research in the meantime when I saw the questions popping up. I think this is primarily an option to set up companies in Estonia electronically. I don't think actually it entails a right to work for employees. However, I'm not really sure about that, but it would be quite surprising because, as I said earlier, from an employment and social security law perspective, it is still decisive where you actually perform the work. So if this scheme would allow actually people to work virtually in Estonia, wherever they are based, this would be like breathtaking because it would change all the rules. Therefore, I'm a bit hesitant to believe that it actually allows that. So I think it's more providing a platform to easily set up companies in Estonia, doing business in Estonia, but not necessarily to employ individuals who are based abroad. But Werner is probably more familiar with the concept than I am.
Actually, yeah, at least I was in Estonia some years ago, and there was a conference on the digital economy, and I think they were quite proud about this. But Katharina, you're right. It looks like this is sort of a company registration scheme, basically. And within the European Union, I can hardly imagine that this would mean evading the labor law and the social protection schemes that exist in Germany or in France, but just by virtually commuting or virtually expatriating yourself to an Estonian firm. So because also Estonia is part of the European Union, I think that also changes the rules as opposed to maybe the what we call a third country places. Yeah, so it's not so easy to work via Estonia if you are not located there.
Probably to better explain why it is actually so difficult, and that links back to what Anna-Lena said earlier on the differences in benefits in the US compared to Europe. So as she said, basically Germany and most European countries, they provide for a lot of statutory social benefits, which is not the case in the US. And this is basically employee and employer funded, and you contribute into a public scheme, which then later on, or which then funds health insurance and pension and so on. And of course, there's, let's say, every country wants as many people as possible to contribute into their scheme to secure funding. So I'd say there's quite some challenge because economies grow older. So the number of contribution payers reduces. And therefore, I think that's actually one of the main obstacles to allow employees just to work from wherever they want. It's actually a question of financials and funding of social welfare.
Excellent. It came in more as a comment, but it actually was a question I had prepared and skipped over, but really relating to maybe employee mental health and preventing burnout. So work from home can have some positive aspects, but if your kids are also there because their school is closed and we all know that it's been stressful living through the pandemic. What can employers do to, maybe help prevent this burnout and just help their employees take care of their mental health?
Probably let me just share a personal experience. In the very early days of the pandemic, I just realized sitting at my laptop at night working, realized all the emails popping in at that time of day where I usually don't get so many emails, that many others just had the same phenomenon. They had to take care of their kids during day and then did their work at nighttime. This is certainly one thing that can be very easily changed by employers, making sure and reassuring employees that they are not requested to work. And not in terms of what are you legally obliged to do, but really tell them, it is okay if you don't do that now. And then again, I think it's leading by example. If you don't send emails to your team at nighttime, even if you say, well, actually, you're not supposed to answer, no, but I think it can build up quite some pressure for others.
I would like to add on this because on the one side, I 100% agree. On the other side, I think it also can provide you some more flexibility. So meaning if I have to I'm a single mom, have to take care of my child. So I'm actually glad that I'm able to work late hours because I can spend some time with my kid during the day, or maybe I also have not the money for childcare. So there's no other options. And also I think if you talk more around global, how do you say, like different time zones, it's also natural that you will get emails in the evenings or in the mornings or during nights. So I think it's also, again, for me, it comes back to a trust culture. What do you expect from your employees? Freedom of work again. And thinking about, now I lost my train of thoughts, but sorry. No, it's gone. Can you, it's really gone. Interesting.
No, but actually, I think the main question, is it your own choice to work at night because it suits you better,
Totally.
or are you required to do that? And I fully agree. If it fits into your daily work schedule, that's great if you're able to do that. Yes, of course.
Now it's back again. So just one last comment. And I think in the end, what an employer can do, and also employee, I think it comes back to a trustful relationship. And with that also raising why I can't work this hours or why I can't, being transparent in the end. And I think as an employer, you also have a responsibility. I think in Germany, it's actually really nice because by law, you have a responsibility to take care of your employee. I'm not sure actually how it is in the US, to be quite frank. But I think having a trustful relationship with your manager can prevent burnout, because you can raise issues when you feel overworked, try to ask for support, which might be not the case if you have not a trustful relationship. So I can therefore just pledge for having a trustful relationship and speaking up.
Absolutely. Werner, I think you were raising your hand.
Yeah. So I would like to basically also subscribe to this point of view. Important here is, I think, to clarify mutual expectations and maybe also mutual non-expectations. And at the same time also take into account, let's say, individual peculiarities, in terms of whatever work, biorhythms or family responsibilities or individual preferences. Without overburdening people, and treating them, let's say, unfairly or highly diversely, I would say. So this is, I think, a quite difficult role that managers have to play here, balancing, let's say, individual preferences or capabilities and still keeping somehow the team or the firm running. This is important. I'm not a big fan of this hard non-availability rule saying, well, nobody is allowed to send out emails after 9 o'clock or on the weekend, or like shutting down whatever email servers companies have. I think this is probably not the way to go, and maybe the most ambitious young talents will even then find ways to send out emails, maybe via private accounts if something is not allowed officially. Or they will continue working even though they have already signed off for the day. So this is about trust and about fairness in a way, but I think it's in a way, it's a soft and entirely also fluid way of interacting.
Excellent. Great. I'm also seeing a question here relating to vaccine mandates. So this is, I think, been in the news in both countries. Here in the US, of course, probably most people know, but the Supreme Court just struck down the Obama administration mandate for large employers of 100 plus. And in Germany, I believe the coalition government is discussing the making it basically a legal requirement from the federal government. Assuming that it doesn't happen in Germany, that the government mandates it, what are best policies for employers then? And here in the US, apparently the government cannot mandate it. So from an individual employer perspective then, what would be your recommendations and best practices balancing maybe health and safety with, you know, health choice and maybe even the potential impact of losing a significant percentage of your workforce that may be opposed to such a mandate? So kind of an open question, but maybe your thoughts on best practices for vaccine mandates at the company level.
I mean, probably let me kick off from a legal point of view, since there's no general obligation to get vaccinated in Germany. Employers simply have no right to request their employees to get vaccinated. So I think the notion has shifted a bit in the course of the pandemic. So now we have a rule that at least allows employers to ask employees to a certain extent whether they are vaccinated or not. And even for the health and safety and care sector, it is possible for employers to ask and request their employees to get vaccinated and to show proof of vaccination. So I think that's one aspect, what is legally possible. The other aspect, I think, is that at least I've heard in the US, it was very common for employers to organize vaccination for their employees. I think this is again then sort of twofolded. It is not that popular here in Germany, but to some extent probably also because everyone is anyhow insured, at least under the public health insurance, and can go to a doctor and get a vaccination if they wish to do so. I mean, in early days, it was difficult to get a vaccination, but now I think there is no more shortage. So if you want to get vaccinated, you can. You simply just go there and get it. And the discussion that is quite fascinating over the pandemic was indeed, is an employer allowed to ask the questions and to get information whether an employee is vaccinated or not? From a personal level, I would just say, well, this makes total sense, because it is sort of interesting to know what's the risk for all others, assuming that vaccination also reduces, at least to a certain extent, the risk to infect others. On the other hand, if you look at that from a very legal perspective, then it's a question of balancing personal rights and of the individual. And if there is no statutory or no legal requirement to get vaccinated, then of course it's the choice of each individual for that they have and can take for themselves whether they want to get vaccinated, yes or no. And as long as that's the position, and this is also, I think, the main reason why the new coalition, the same as the last government, are struggling very much with this question, that legally it is actually very, very difficult to implement such a requirement due to the high notion of protection of personal rights.
Kevin, do you potentially have anything to add from the American perspective?
Well, I think it's so dependent in the U.S. on the health and safety protocols that you want to have in place. So if you have employees who are customer facing, that's one consideration. If you're dealing with clients who may have mandates, then if you have to have vaccinations to go visit them. So all those considerations are necessary. And I don't know what the right answer is. In fact, I don't even think we have at this point clear, definitive science with the Omicron variant and the way that spread on the efficacy of vaccines, whether you see the fourth dose data from Israel, other parts of the world. So there's just so much we don't know. It makes it so challenging from a policy standpoint to be prescriptive when there are so many unknowns.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, looking at the time here, I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague Elena for some final closing remarks. But from my side, thanks again to the audience and everyone for tuning in. And of course, a special thanks for our 4 experts here. I really, really enjoyed your remarks. Been involved in a lot of these, and maybe it's just because I work in the field myself in recruiting, but found this one to be particularly fascinating. So thank you again for both your presentations and your insights in the panel. Of course, as you have all seen, this has been recorded, so we will be posting this in the coming days on the GACC Midwest YouTube channel. So if anyone would like to go and rewatch part of this, please do. And before we close up the thing here, if you haven't already clicked on the link to get the speaker bios that have the links to their individual LinkedIn profiles, now's your chance to do that in case you'd like to follow up and connect with our experts here one-on-one after the event. So with that, thanks again from my side, and Elena, please, give your final remarks here.
Yeah, no, thank you everyone for joining us today. And as Justin mentioned, we have their LinkedIns connected as well to that agenda that was shared earlier, or you can reach out to me individually if you would like to get connected with any of them. We do have that final event coming up in March, as I mentioned earlier as well, where we will revisit this topic along with all the other ones we discussed over the course of the year during this initiative. And this project was supported by the Transatlantic Program of the Federal Republic of Germany, which was funded by the European Recovery Program of the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And they are also going to be supporting us in our series publication that will be released in March. So if you would like to join us in March, we would love to see you there, either virtually or in person. And with that, yeah, I think that's it from my end as well. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Have a nice day. Bye.